And the long young Papa, Saint Tangi, Songi, Hong Kong Toppers, Teje, around Pound, some nearby.
So once again, it is important to make sure that we're here with the proper motivation. The motivation should of course be to listen to these Dharma instructions so that we are enabled to, in the future, establish all sentient beings in the awakening of Buddhahood. So with that motivation and attitude at heart, let us now listen to Rinpoche's instructions.
And the one who just said Chongxin, Rong Mahi, Trade, and around Sanda, and then Mo Domba, Churko, Rongin Sarva, Tongo, Chana Sutun, Truk, Yenmesi Petan, Mo, good jiggy, number around Sama, Ye Deman, Yori, Songa. I did around Sama, good jiggy more than the children, one and Kova, Hansin in Chanko, Yena, Ranga Romo Master, Maruk, Ramude, Ranga, Marik, then Kova and Chanko. Yes, Tela, Ranga, Ramud, the Duncan Kova and Changu, and Maru, Semga Mote, Tumba. Tumba Tela, now, number daughter, Shambach. And Tumba Tumjoma, Rongi Sarvati Chati Yorava. Sarvati Chatella, the Yin, some Dajin is a top at the Jim. Say, more than what we saw, yes, but yonder Yori, Yanate Romo machine, that Tumba Richala, daughter Shin, Sarva Richala, Yin or Sonson, then Dajin is on yes.
In Chagma Rinpoche's preceding verses, we have heard how we are endowed with the qualities or with the potential of Buddhahood which is manifested or which can be explained by way of the four kayas. Our mind being empty, which corresponds to the Dhammakaya aspect, yet being vividly present at all times, which corresponds to the Sambhogakaya aspect, and then we have also the Manakaya, Svabhavika, and so forth. So we have heard about these points repeatedly, and we may then wonder why, as Kamachagme continues to ask in his next verse, why do we wander in samsara? Why do we wander in this constant circle of suffering? Why do we not break out of this constant circle of suffering? Well, he gives us the answer right away in the next slide, where he says we do so because of not understanding ourselves, of not recognizing or knowing ourselves. We have not understood until the present moment that our mind nature is, as we have already heard in the preceding teachings, that which is the empty aspect of our minds, the utterly ungraspable aspect of our mind nature, which is called the Dharmakaya, that quality of mind that goes completely without any shape, any color, any particular place where it comes from, dwells or disappears to. That is the empty aspect of mind which we mistakenly understand to be or grasp onto to be that which we want to call self. And the vividly present quality of mind, the perceiving quality of mind, that which is always there, which is the very basis for perception, or whatever it is that might come along in this way, that is the what we call the Sambhogakaya, that we mistakenly take to be something other than the self. So from the very beginning we have made this fundamental mistake of misunderstanding these aspects of mind as self, which has never ever existed in the first place, as well as something other as the self, everything other than that we consider to be different from the self, which also has never existed as such in the first place. Because that is the case, because we do not recognize our own face, as it literally says in the text, or our true face, because that is the case, we are still wandering in samsara, because we hold on to these erroneous notions of a self, out of which, logically so we think, follows that there must be something other than self. everything that appears to be different from that which we hold to be a self. Because of that fundamental error, we wander in samsara. Having obviously thoroughly misunderstood the nature of that which we term self, the nature of our mind itself, and misinterpreting it as a self, as me or I, thinking in terms of mine, etc., and so forth, that is the very reason that we find ourselves in this cycle of samsara time and again, following this mistaken idea of a self and everything that goes along with it. Of course, all sorts of emotional defilements such as pride, as jealousy, as desire, arrogance for that matter, etc. and so forth appear, and under the influence of these we perform all sorts of actions which serve to keep us fettered to samsara. So this is basically the driving force or the root cause for our being fettered to, being bound to samsara without any seeming way out of there. Rinpoche continues with an analogy, and he says, for instance, we are like the person who has hearthstones or firestones, fireplace stones of gold, yet doesn't know about this and suffers from starvation or suffers from hunger and thirst. In Tibet, particularly in Eastern Tibet here, particularly Eastern Tibetan terms being used here, it is the custom that a fireplace, both inside the house and the kitchen as well as in nomadic dwellings, is made of stones. One would have 3 or 4 stones in the middle of which one would light the fire and put one's pot on top, etc. And the analogy that is used here is these stones being either of gold or containing gold in whichever way. If a family who has such hearthstones does not know about it, actually they are in the possession of great wealth but doesn't know about it, then they will continue to be poor, they will continue to have all sorts of problems and to suffer hunger and thirst in a worst case scenario, while not knowing that they're actually in the possession of such great wealth, while not knowing that they actually have gold in their possession. And he likens our ignorance about our true nature to such a person who has gold in his possession yet is unaware of it. The last line of this verse reads, to point out exactly this is the great kindness of the Guru. So it is the Guru who points out to us the nature of our mind, how it is and how to understand and how to experience it. We are presently just like the family who has these golden hearthstones in the very center, in the very middle of their dwelling, in their kitchen, for instance, yet is unawares of the fact that they are already in the possession of great wealth and potentially great prosperity. It is exactly the same with us. Our mind nature, our mind for that matter, is endowed with the Buddha potential, has the qualities of the four Buddhakayas, yet we have not recognized it. Therefore, to point out this fact and to guide us along the path, the practice that is necessary to recognize this, that is the great kindness that the Guru shows us. Yet to be pointed in the right direction alone doesn't make much of a difference yet. It is just like as if someone came into the house of said family and would point out to them, you have a fireplace of gold. Even if they then recognize that the hearthstones are made of gold, that in itself does not alleviate their pangs of hunger. Who would have ever been satisfied by eating gold? Such a thing is unheard of. So Kamachakma advises us that, of course, we would have to make use of the gold. It would have to be sold, converted into a currency in any which way, with which we could buy food, which would then have to be prepared and then eaten. This is the way, the proper sequence of procedures that have to be followed for us in order to benefit from the gold. So just as the family would have to recognize, aha, we've got gold, and would then have to make it into money with which to buy food, which is to be prepared accordingly and to eat it, accordingly we also would have to proceed once we have received certain pointing outs from our Guru. And accordingly, Chagama Rinpoche instructs us that in the same way, after you have received the pointing out by the Guru, only if you train yourself in this instruction will your delusion be cleared away and will you eventually be liberated. That means to say, just like in the analogy that we have used before, you have to make use of that which you're given, or you have to make use of that which you're being told. The Lama just pointing out how it is with your mind nature, pointing out its nature to you, that in itself is all very well and good, but that in itself does not produce liberation for you. You have to actually sit down and put the instruction that you have received from the Lama into practice. You have to not simply nod and say, yes, how true, how wonderful, but you have to make it your own experience. And through your own experience, you have to gain certainty in the validity of that which the Lama has pointed out. Then it will make a difference. Then you can proceed onwards, you can develop, and you will eventually be liberated from samsara. If you simply leave it at having received the pointing out, and do not follow that up with your own practice, well, then nothing much at all will happen. And again, as we have already heard before, both the sutras of the Mahayana tradition as well as the tantras of the Mantrayana tradition are complete agreement that mind in itself is Buddhahood, or that mind in itself is endowed with Buddha potential. So whether we should study the sutras of the Mahayana tradition taught by the Buddha and his and those who came after him, or whether we should study the various tantra classes that we find in the tradition of the secret Mantrayana, the intent of them is the same in the regard, in that regard, that they all recognize that same fact, that mind nature itself bears the potential for Buddhahood. However, continues Karma Chakra, the Sutra tradition does not recognize the body as being potentially Buddha, and therefore it is a rather lengthy path. So both Sutra and Tantra tradition recognize the fact that mind nature is endowed with Buddha nature. However, in the Sutrayana tradition we do not have the various practices, the various skillful means, such as recognizing one's body or imagining one's body as the Yidam deity with the channels, winds, essences, the subtle energy system that the Yidam body is made up of. And these quickly transforming methods are not known in the Sutra tradition. Therefore, according to the Sutra tradition, as opposed to the Tantra tradition, the path that leads to the liberation of Buddhahood, to the awakening of Buddhahood, which is the liberation from the cycle of suffering, is a very lengthy one compared to the Tantra path. It is a fairly lengthy one because we have to train ourselves in the transcendent virtues such as generosity, as patience, as proper rightful conduct, etc., and so forth, and accumulate merit through these transcendent virtues. And that path, as opposed to the Mantrayana path, is a very lengthy one. It's one that takes so much longer to achieve the liberation of Buddhahood than the mantra path does. In regards to the rather lengthy Sutrayana path, Kamachakma says that Buddhahood is achieved after 3 incalculable eons. So 3 eons, the length of which we could not fathom, we could not number in years or anything of that matter. It takes in order to purify oneself, in order to achieve liberation, according to the Sutrayana path. If we would express this by way of the 5 kinds of paths, 5 aspects of development to be traversed in the course of our practice, then for the first eon, one would say that one trains oneself in what is known as the path of accumulation and the path of joining. In the course of such practice, we train ourselves in the accumulation of merit and the accumulation of putting things into practice, etc., and so forth, until certain insights or certain understanding is produced, so that we can move on to the next step. So that would already take the first eon. The second one, the second eon, is then being reached once we have reached the path of seeing, as it is called. We have then achieved what is known as the first Bodhisattva Bhumi, the first Bodhisattva stage, from where onwards we will then proceed through the stages towards Buddhahood. For that second age, that second eon, we will then traverse from the very first to the 7th Bodhisattva Bhumi. And these 7 bhumis are, these first 7 bhumis are known as the impure bhumis, or the impure Bodhisattva stages, because while we find ourselves on these, we are still being obscured by various kinds of veils and obscurations, predominantly by our emotional defilements, the veils and obscurations which are being produced through our emotional defilements and shortcomings of that sort, as well as veils and obscurations in regard to objects of knowledge or objects of understanding. Once we have then eventually eradicated these, we have then eventually reached the culmination of the 7th Bodhisattva Bhumi, and that takes care of the 2nd incalculable eon for which we practice in this way. And then we move into the 3rd one, in the course of which we will traverse the 8th, the 9th, and finally the 10th Bodhisattva Bhumi. At that point in time, the vast majority of the emotional defilements and obscurations which are caused through our emotional defilements and through ignorance or obscurations in regard to objects of knowledge will have been purified. What remains to be purified on the 3 higher Bodhisattva Bhumis are certain obscurations which come about through very subtle habitual tendencies. These various habitual tendencies, these habits, however subtle they may be, and they will be ever more subtle as we progress through the stages, are then eventually purified, eradicated, until we have then, at the very end of the 3rd incalculable eon, then achieved the awakening, or the 10th Bodhisattva Bhumi, until we are basically have come to the point that immediately precedes the achievement of Buddhahood.
샤자도 공을 사는 그 초사의 값을 아니 공을 르문다와는 거와 생기는 동론다만다만 르렌주 아니 르티게 되니 총총나 점바동 총총나 제파강 생생한 초사의 거와 아니 공 아니 값제가 원고체 아니 치와 조동데 뭐 카도 까보지 전체 진짜게 르롱안에 찾아서 대예가나 무슨도 손이 상세 당고 나세라 참참나 송아 아니 나 투보 요리 되니 다들은 랑자니 많이네 된 랑도서 말이 되니 나세비 파상수 니마제라 성 니라 성 성나 니마 나도 든지제고 작절라 성 짠이 랑마서래 신나 첨보래 나서 첨보래 다 그런 정장가 사마산이 요말 되니 사마메를 다 제강도 너무 첨보요래 아지 하고서
그래서 그 생계들이 그런 소탄
랑부지
랑부지
가보지
가루
치와 종소리 종 너무 치와 성 너무 치와 성
대단 잠깐만요.
랑부지 치와 종이 초부터 봤을 때 다 된디 요리 다 저한테 통사지도 보도록 계산가 만다 마시나 다 저한테 가시지 엔디다리 오고
In this particular way, across 3 incalculable eons, traversing all of these paths, accumulating merits, purifying himself of ever more subtle veils and obscurations, that is exactly the way in which our Buddha Shakyamuni has practiced. From the moment that he resolved to achieve enlightenment for the sake of beings in the presence of the Buddha Shakyamuni, until he then demonstrated the enlightenment of Buddhahood in our time and age. He, of course, over the course of this time, was born many times in all sorts of many different bodies. And one time he was also born in the body of an elephant. Not an ordinary elephant, but a rather extraordinary one, a white elephant, which are considered to be very particular in India. And on top of that, he was an even more special individual. He was a white elephant with 6 tusks. Anyway, that elephant was the Buddha. He was born in this particular body, and at that time it came to pass that a group of 32 people ventured into a thick forest. For the first couple of days everything was all well, and they traveled through the forest for whatever reason, we have not been told yet, until eventually they lost their way. They wandered around and around, their provisions got lower and lower, And they had just completely lost it. They didn't know where they were becoming hungry and thirsty, and of course their distress was indeed great. So this group of people was completely lost in the thickest of forests. There was no back, there was no forth, and eventually they came to an extremely steep cliff. The path was completely cut off, and they just were at the end of their rope, at the end of their wits at the same time. Of course, they were also suffering from great hunger and thirst, and in utter despair as to what to do. All of a sudden there was that voice from high above, which shouted at them, which said, "Hey, you guys down there, this is the wrong way, come on up here." And they looked up, and instead of a person, they saw that white elephant, which was of course a rather miraculous thing. Who has seen a white elephant before who talks the way of humans? Anyway, they were greatly delighted and thought maybe we should follow the clue, and they followed the clue, and the voice of the elephant continued to say, "If you come up this way, you will also find some food." So they clambered up and eventually came upon the spot where the elephant that had heretofore spoken to them lay dead. Now, an elephant, being a rather large animal, of course provided lots of food. There were 32 of them who were rather hungry, so immediately they set to cutting up the elephant and preparing the meat in any which way whatsoever. So this way they were saved from immediate starvation, and there was lots and lots of elephant flesh left over, so each and every one of them took a piece and carried it on his back. And they continued on their way, and it is said that after 5 days or so, eventually they found their way out of the forest, they found their way home, still with lots of meat to spare on their backs. This is one of the stories of the previous life of the Buddha, in which he had taken on the physical form of an elephant, and he had used that in order to present his own body to those in need, so it could be used for their food in order to save them from starvation. So we have heard time and again that we are, like all other beings, not a single one excluded, endowed with Buddhahood. The Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha as it is called, is part and parcel of our mind stream. We've never been without it. It has always been with us. It will always remain with us. What remains to be done in order to recognize, to understand that fact, is to sit down and practice. When we sit down to practice, to familiarize ourselves with mind nature, for the most part, that kind of practice is known as Mahamudra. And this training, this practice of Mahamudra has been put into practice, has been trained in by many beings in the past who have achieved the corresponding accomplishments and realizations. These are commonly known as the great accomplished ones, the Mahasiddhas of India, of Tibet, and what remains to be done for us is to simply sit down and do the same thing. If we were to sit down and put Mahamudra into practice and accordingly realize mind nature as it truly is, also we would bring about the same accomplishments and the same abilities. And in that regard, having said that, Rinpoche says he by all means expects that at least some of us do that, sit down on our butts and simply do it, and maybe in a couple of years, after a few more summer courses, we will also be able to demonstrate such abilities as the Mahasiddhas of old have done. There may by all means be some, having practiced accordingly, who are able to fly from here to there through the air, or who are able to walk through closed doors from the outside to the inside, or from the inside to the outside, or who have the ability of understanding the thoughts of others, who have the ability to read others' minds, etc. That would be the end of the interviews, wouldn't it? So what needs to be done is to put it into practice. And with this, Rinpoche says, we should do this right now. Put it into practice. Only through practice will we eventually bring about these accomplishments. If we do nothing, then nothing will happen, of course.
Yeah.
Let's meditate. Let's just rest in consciousness. If a thought happens, simply recognize it as what it is.
I try, I try this.
A few questions.
I do a sensitive one.
Again, it is the time to dedicate our marriage for the sake of God.